So, hi everyone. Welcome. My name is Lori. I'm just going to quickly introduce our organization, IAALA, IAALA, which we refer to as IAALA, and also introduce our speaker for the day. So, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are in the world. We are very pleased to have you join us for today's IAALA in Focus event. In case you don't know, IAALA stands for the International Association of Armenian Librarians and Archivists. IAALA was created to provide a worldwide platform for archivists and librarians working with Armenian collections to network with each other, share information and ideas, and solve challenges, promote issues important to our field, encourage participation and provide mentorship, and to uncover, surface, and map hidden collections, both physical and digital. We encourage you to visit our website, iaala.org, to find out more about us, to view some of our past IAALA and Focus events, to read the latest news about what's going on in IAALA, and to also consider joining this all-volunteer effort. So, without further ado, I would like to introduce today's presenter, Gegham Mughnetsyan. And his presentation is titled When Archives Speak, Oral Histories at the USC Dornsife Institute of Armenian Studies. Gegham is the Chitjian researcher archivist of the USC Dornsife Institute of Armenian Studies, where he oversees the archival and library collections of the Institute and also manages the Institute's Displaced Persons Documentation Project and Understanding Independence Oral History projects. Gegham is also a doctoral student at USC's History Department, looking at the history of Armenian Americans in Los Angeles. Gegham holds a BA from UC Berkeley in Peace and Conflict Studies and an MA from the American University in Washington, D.C. in International Affairs. So, without further ado, I will let Gegham get started. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Why does it echo like that? All right. I hope it doesn't echo again. Hello, everyone, and good morning to everybody joining from the West Coast, and Party to everyone joining from Yerevan. Today, I will be, as Lori mentioned in her introduction, I have been the archivist of the Dornsife Institute of Armenian Studies for almost 10 years. And in May of next year, it'll be my 10th year at USC. And since 2018, I have been the archivist of the Institute, where a large portion of our work has been comprised of collecting and documenting and archiving of oral histories. Today, my presentation is about that work. Let me quickly share my presentation and get started. All right. So a quick introduction of what oral histories are and how we came to be involved in this work at Institute of Armenian Studies. Oral history is a research method and an archival form that records, preserves, and interprets spoken memories and firsthand accounts to document lived experiences that might not otherwise appear in institutional sources, from which stories of minoritized groups and Armenians in particular are sometimes absent from. Uh, what are the importances of oral histories in the Armenian studies? I've divided this into 3 points. Is that first of all, it preserves marginalized voices, as oral history captures the lived experiences of Armenians, be they survivors, migrants, community members, or just Armenians in general with very diverse experiences, whose stories are often absent from official state or institutional archives. Sometimes not due to fault of those archives, but just because Armenians, especially the ones who have been diasporized, have gone through so many traumatic experiences that sometimes they're just absent from various records. So then what it does also is it reconstructs those disrupted histories and provides crucial evidence for understanding displacement, diasporic formation, and intergenerational memory, especially where written records are scarce or destroyed. And finally, it expands the archival landscape. Oral histories broaden the methodological and source base of Armenian studies, enabling scholars to analyze identity, cultural continuity, and social change through personal narratives and community knowledge. At the end of the day, this is a database of primary sources for researchers to use. Oral histories endure as archives that speak, the title that I used for this presentation, by carrying the breadth of memory across generations so that the past continues to live, resonate, and reveal itself anew. So, oral history, the origins of oral histories in Armenian studies, particularly, is that it has a bit of a complicated history because traditionally oral histories in Armenian studies context had been viewed as testimony in the context of the academic fight in support for the recognition of Armenian genocide. Scholars starting in the in mid to late 20th century started collecting and documenting the stories of the survivors of the Armenian genocide in order to collect this vital information for, in a sense, a future trial or like a trial of history to have these uh, pretty much personal accounts as testimony. That's why we had first collections of Armenian oral histories were all genocide collections. And in order not to dive in too much into this field, I would invite everybody to read the latest in the article in the latest special issue of the Archival Science, authored by my colleague Manuk Avetikyan and Dr. Arman Khachaterian from the Genocide Institute in Yerevan about Armenian genocide survivor oral histories as an archival resource, which talks about the collections at the Columbia, at the Zorian Institute, at the Shoah Foundation, the collection by Armenian Assembly, and by the late Professor Richard Hovhannisyan, all of which revolved around these stories and accounts of the survivors of the Armenian genocide. So while doing this important work, what it did is it complicated oral history as a concept in Armenian studies, where whenever approached, we were even us when we were approaching people about their histories, their initial reaction was like, "Well, I didn't go through the genocide. What do I have to tell?" Or we are not genocide survivors. And we had to go through this whole reframing of oral history in Armenian studies in the contemporary period, in the post-genocide period, to again bring up the value of oral history as an archive, uh, past as an Armenian genocide testimony. So we at the Institute started collecting oral histories in 2018 with the express goal to fill in gaps in traditional archives with oral histories. The catalyst for this project and a very particular subset of oral histories that we have at the Institute, which ended up being our first major oral history collection, was the Displaced Persons Documentation Project, where we started collecting oral histories of this community of Armenians who, during World War II, were displaced from their homes in the Soviet Union, particularly in Soviet Ukraine, which fell under German occupation. They were transported to Germany as forced labor, and then after the war, many of them ended up in the United States. Eventually, a large group of them settled in the suburb of Los Angeles in Montebello. The community was very eager to document their parents, their grandparents' stories, and in 2018, it became the first collection of the Institute. Here in this picture, I'm with again Monica Agemian, who was our first interviewee of the Displaced Persons Project. Eventually, the collection, particularly that one dealing with the displaced persons, ended up having over 40 interviews and numerous other physical archives that came in through that work. As you can see here, we were going in and interviewing people in their homes where they had photographs, documentation that they were also showing to us, and then many times sharing with the Institute, knowing that there is an Armenian academic unit now that could do justice to their archives and not only document their stories, but also take and scan and catalog their archival materials to supplement their oral histories. So eventually we ended up having four major oral history collections at the Institute, which are still in many ways ongoing. First, as I mentioned, being the Displaced Persons Documentation Project, which dealt with the displaced Armenians of World War II. Then again in 2018, which marked at the time was marking the 30th anniversary of the start of the Armenian independence movement in 1988, also known as the Karabakh movement. So, which also the movement itself lacks, at the time at least, lacked a lot of written record about it. There were very few cases, I think you could even count on fingers of one hand, memoirs of people who had written about the 1988 movement. And then there were very few and only recently emerging historical writings or research about how the 1988 period had shaped what had come to be the newly independent Republic of Armenia. So there was a effort from the Institute to start documenting the stories of people who stood at the center of this movement. And from that was born the Understanding Independence project of oral histories of Armenia from 1988 to 1996, which was almost entirely done and is still being recorded in Armenia, where we have a crew on ground that have done these interviews since 2018. The project is still ongoing. We intend to collect at least 100 interviews. Then they will slowly become available for researchers to use. It's nice to know that I think at least two people who are currently following this talk have been interviewed for this collection. So that project is ongoing. It's a major project. And then even larger project came along in 2020, 2021, where largely inspired by the work we did with displaced persons, the intention had always been that we would expand this project to collect stories of Armenians, Armenian Americans in Los Angeles or in California at large, because the tapestry of stories of Armenians in this part of the world is immense. And so from that was born the California History Through Armenian Experiences project, which was at the time generously supported by the State Assembly of California through the efforts of Assembly Member Adrin Nazarian at the time. And the project slowly we were able to formulate the project. Again, my colleagues, Manuk Avedikian and Dr. Lilit Keshishian, were the project managers of this. But unlike the Displaced Persons Project, where almost the entirety of the interviews were conducted by myself, the California History Project had multiple interviewers uh, because it was a larger project with Manuk and Lilith doing the majority of the interviews. Many other interviews also participated in the project. And then we were able to collect oral histories from Los Angeles and expand out to the rest of to California, to NorCal, to Central Valley, to San Diego, uh, and vibrant interviews. I think about 200 or so interviews we were able to collect. And the last project that kind of was born out of necessity, even as I mentioned, these oral histories we were conducting, we are going to people's homes and meeting them where they were in comfort, in their offices sometimes, to collect these interviews. And in 2020, when COVID came along, we were no longer able to do this work for to almost 3 years. The university was on lockdown. We were at home. And so from there was born this idea that we could provide people with the tools to interview their loved ones at home themselves, since everybody was stuck at home. And from this was born My Armenian Story, the crowdsourced oral histories, where we pretty much shared with people our methodology of doing oral histories. We provided them with questionnaires in multiple languages. We provided them with tools of down to how to set up your iPhone to record, how to make sure there is lighting, how to make sure you press record before you start interviewing. So, and then from that, we started receiving a number of interviews that people conducted with their grandparents, with their friends, with their relatives, with their colleagues in that period, from 2020 to 2023, when we had a lot of activity. Obviously, those are varying in nature and substance and kind, because it wasn't us interviewing where we keep a certain regimented questionnaire of asking people something. These were people, sometimes students interviewing their grandparents, siblings interviewing their siblings. And so this in collection we also have, which the plans are also to at some point, along with the others, to catalog and make accessible to people who are both interested in this DIY style of oral histories, which can be implemented outside of an academic institute. And we have had experiences of it where professors have assigned this in their classroom to their students, and whose students have gone out and made their final projects based on this, where they have interviewed somebody and then made an oral history project out of it. So, uh, what is a typical workflow of an oral history collection for an archival institution, which in many ways mirrors how our other archival ingestion happens, but in some ways it is different, as it first there has to be set up, the interview has to be set up. In many cases, there is a pre-interview, then there is the actual recording of the interview, then storing of the initial files. Then, if there is the decision to transcribe or translate or tag, that also happens. And finally, it becomes available, because that is one of the pillars or caveats of an oral history, is that it has to be recorded, it has to be cataloged or documented, and it has to be shared. It has to be accessible for others to use or to listen to. And so those are generally the four stages we go through. Some oral histories are not transcribed, some don't need translation. All of them do need tagging of various degrees. And then the last phase of it is making them accessible, which in our case, the process is that everything eventually will become accessible through USC's digital library. That process is ongoing. Whatever is not yet accessible through the USC digital libraries are is stored on drives and hard drives in digital cloud, because that is the nature of oral histories or born digital archives in general, that they need to be stored in 2 to 3 locations just in case for safety reasons. The one file drive crashes, you have a backup somewhere else. So that in the meantime, we can provide access to researchers or family members of those who have been interviewed while still the interviews or materials are being uh, tagged or prepared to be ingested into the digital library. So, and those are because, as I mentioned, our oral histories were already being recorded digitally. We don't have VHS or camcorder tapes that we then need to also preserve the physical tapes. These are already born digital archives, which means that they are created in digital form from the intake. Uh, this provides this has a lot of pluses, as that you don't need to then worry about physical storage of uh, VHS tapes, reel-to-reel tapes, which we also have some at the Institute, and they are a challenge to preserve for posterity. But the major challenge of the Born Digital archives is that while they provide great access, they are very vulnerable. When shared drives uh, go out of uh, function, or when hard drives are slightly damaged, you might be in a position where you might lose uh, these digital files, or somebody accidentally might delete a folder thinking that there is a copy somewhere else. So it takes very diligent work to make sure that everything has copies in 2 or 3 different places. Everything is accounted for, files are named properly, if it is a copy of a file, if it is the actual high resolution file, the original recording, so that these mishaps don't happen where you unfortunately might lose some files. So, what are the challenges in archiving oral histories in general? Well, there are the technical challenges of storage, formats. These are large files. We shot most of our oral histories in 4K format, and you simply have the challenge of enough cloud storage to store these places. There are also ethical challenges of consent, sensitivity, as I mentioned, especially with our Understanding Independence collection, where we at this point, I think, have oral histories of 3 or 4 former prime ministers of Armenia, heads of parliament, ambassadors, people who were just in government positions. And so you have to be very careful and very mindful of what people share with you, so that then you are a good steward to their stories. If people do have reservations of how their stories are shared, if they want people to first uh, pretty much apply for access, then you do honor those. Because at the end of the day, oral history is the uh, possession of the people who record it, as in the institution, but also of the people who have given their stories, because their story is their story at the end of the day. So those are sensitivities that need to be taken into account. Another challenge is metadata and cataloging. Some of these oral histories could be 5, 10, 15, 20 hours, which is a lot of information, and that needs to be cataloged and tagged. depending on the degree of detail you would want to tag these things. We, at least at the Institute, transcribe them by minute increments and then try to tag them along. And then you have to ensure the authenticity of these files and be a good steward to them. I mean, these are uh, video interviews. We do video format, and people can copy and use them. So you have to make sure that you do justice for the people who have trusted you with their life stories. So this is for an example I wanted to give as how they will look, and then how presently they look on USC's digital library. If you do visit the USC Digital Library and then you search for Institute of Armenian Studies digital collection, it'll bring up our digital collection, and whatever has so far been uploaded up there you can see, and whatever will be uploaded as we go along will appear on this page. For most of oral histories, we have the excerpts of the oral histories, which are the first 10 minutes, because as I mentioned, the files are large, so that we, in order to not crowd this place a lot, we have those up there for people to see, where they can assess for themselves. If they want to actually go ahead and watch the full version, then they can send a request, and that will be granted to them, so they can actually go ahead and then use the full videos for their research. Our collection does not just have oral history interviews per se. There are also, as I mentioned, when we would go to do these oral histories, we would be given or we would have the opportunity to scan photographs and documents that people deemed important to their journeys, to their oral collections. And so these would also be scanned and documented, which are also here as part of people's oral histories. And by making them accessible, by making them part of a university's library, we ensure future access for these files, that they are not just stored on our hard drives and on the cloud, but they are a part of a university library and university archives. So what is the future of these projects, and what importance do they hold for both Armenian studies and for archival research? As I mentioned, most of these, our collections are still largely ongoing. We are still collecting interviews, especially for understanding independence. Even today or this week, there will be interviews done in Yerevan with members, with people who had played a crucial role during that independence movement. So the future, what we see for ourselves at the Institute of Armenian Studies, is to uh, archive the oral histories and link them to the physical archives that I mentioned that we have collected, because as I had stated originally, our goal was to fill in the gaps in both archives and in the historical narrative that are left, and that oral histories can supplement and enhance. So our goal is to make those connections and expand access to our collections, so that people do not have to, first of all, make a journey to University of Southern California to access these files. They can access them globally, as our people are spread out globally in institutions throughout the world, and also support future scholarship based on these primary sources. For an example here, I've included my own work, which came out last year in the collection, The Armenian Diaspora and Stateless Power, Collective Identity in the Transnational 20th Century, where my chapter on the Armenian displaced persons is largely informed by the oral histories I collected starting in 2018 for our displaced persons documentation project. So that's what I wanted to, where I would want to end my presentation, is that it has been a great honor and privilege to get to listen to people's stories and document them. In many cases, we would end up in situations where what people would share would be the first time they had shared in decades, and we would be in a position to hear, document, and promise to them that we would be good stewards to their stories, to make them accessible to researchers, to scholars who would then do in their work, include this in their work, and give it proper scholarly and academic treatment that these histories deserve. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gegham. That was amazing. I really enjoyed hearing about it, actually, particularly because, I'm at the American University of Armenia, and we are trying to expand our oral history or ingest more oral history collections. Um, and so I think we're still in the very beginning stages of that, but I'm going to have a lot of questions along the way, so I may need your email address to contact you later.
Gladly, gladly.
We have some questions in the chat. There's one about the Promise Institute. Maybe they want to expand on what they wanted to ask there about the Promise Institute. Nora's asking, do you collect any stories of migrations from different Armenian diaspora communities?
Yes, that's a very good question. This semester I had a class on histories of global South, and first day I was in class, I mentioned to my professor that even though we do oral histories of Los Angeles, our oral histories are largely oral histories of the global South, because we interview people for 4 or 5 hours, and first 3 hours is their life in the Middle East, and then the last 30 minutes is Los Angeles, because that's what people brought with them, right? So we have oral histories of people from everywhere, people who have come here from all corners of the Middle East, from Europe, from the Republic of Armenia, from Russia. As I mentioned, my displaced persons collection are largely Armenians who were born in Kharkiv, who were born in Novorossiysk, in the Russian North Caucasus, Black Sea region. And these are people whose parents were then genocide survivors who had moved to these regions. So these are multi-layered, multi-generational stories from all corners of the world that find their final destination in Los Angeles or Southern California. So yeah, even when I mentioned that, even the understanding independence stories, which are particular stories of Armenia in 1988, our goal had always been that our oral histories were going to be life encompassing stories. So we start with where were you born, who were your parents, who were your grandparents, and then end up where we end up. So these encompass a lot of stories of the world.
We have another question in the chat. For metadata and access end of oral histories, how's the process for more distinct dialects like Julfa or a mixture of dialects, different languages and slang?
So for metadata, it is a bit complicated, but because for most of our oral histories, I think for almost all of them, we do provide, or we at least transcribe them. For understanding independence, at least everything is going to be translated also to English. But I think for the California one, because it was such a large collection, we might not be translating it from the beginning. I guess we'll give access, and then we will probably provide some scholars some to make some translations. The DP interviews were all translated, and then as I mentioned again, you kind tied to Nora's question. We have DP interviews of people who were, as I mentioned, born in Novorossiysk, and moved to Germany and then ended up in Los Angeles. For example, Digin Manik, our first interview, who spoke in Yerzanga dialect. Person who had never been to Yerzanga, her parents are from there, but that's what she speaks with. So we transcribe as we hear it. We don't correct people's speech. So obviously, this language is one person I interviewed years ago would say that we don't usually share our stories because a person needs to be fluent in four languages to understand them. So sometimes these interviews go in code switching from Armenian to Russian to German to English to their local dialects. So at least the transcript is there, and a person can search through transcript, while metadata is a little bit difficult in that sense, as wherever things are possible, we do include tags in different places. For example, especially when it comes to location names, right, from different places that might have changed names several times. But when it comes to dialect itself, it is a bit difficult to create tags for dialect.
Vana asks, have DPs from other states in the US been involved?
Yes, very few, because there are very few DPs in other states. There used to be initially when their first round of migration, most of them ended up on the East Coast and then gradually made their way to the West Coast. So very few actually stayed originally where they had landed. So we traveled and then we conducted interviews in New Jersey, in Boston, in New York, in Chicago. So we have done, and then outside of Los Angeles too, we did a couple of them in Fresno. So we tried to reach to whoever we could who was outside of California, at least, or outside of Montebello or Los Angeles. But it's just and then there was always the sad part of it where we would go and interview people, and then people would say, where were you 10 years ago, right? This should have started like 20 years ago when our parents were alive, or when our seniors were alive, which is always I guess, in a sense, the tragedy of Armenian oral history collection. We're always too late in many of these cases, where then there are a handful of people left who can provide this context for us.
Mark Rosen asks, to what degree does the Promise Institute at UCLA assist you with individuals and direction in finding people in Southern California and Central California area, especially Fresno, for additional interviews at USC?
I don't think we've had any work. I don't think the Promise Institute does any oral history work that we have done with. We have, as I mentioned, for California Histories, we had two, at the time, I think they were still doctoral students from UCLA who partook in it, who became interviewers. Sona Tajirian and Rosie Arush, who are both doctors now, who did interviews in there for the project. But I don't think there has been any explicit, I, other than people affiliated in the sense that we mutually have known, but there hasn't been any kind of a official or a institutional relationship as it comes to oral histories, even though we collaborate in many things and constantly are in support of each other's efforts. But as far as oral histories goes, there hasn't been, to my knowledge.
Felix has a suggestion. It would be very helpful for people like me who don't speak Armenian to have transcripts of the interviews to read directly in English or using online translation.
Yes, as I mentioned, the large chunk of these interviews are going to be available in English, either by transcription or in the case of California interviews, majority of them are already in English. So there is a critical mass of these interviews, even for the DP ones. There's a large part of it that were already in English. And as I mentioned, the understanding independence ones are all going to be translated and available with English transcripts. So, in any case, our mandate and our goal is to provide largest access possible. So even if immediately that might be not visible, because as I mentioned, these interviews are lengthy and it takes a lot of time to first transcribe, then to translate. And when it comes to Armenian, you can't just simply run this through an AI that gives you at least a transcription, which is sometimes possible for English interviews. In Armenian, these dialectical things and language peculiarities come into issue. So where a person needs to sit there and do these, which takes time. But we, uh, I'm confident that everything will be accessible for researchers and scholars, even if it is not for particularly somebody asks, we will make sure to provide that.
Andrew asks if AI, which you just touched upon, is used at any point during the process to alleviate the workload for metadata and transcription, and what precautions are taken to ensure the record is accurate.
Yeah, so in no case in our work does even if it's AI or even if it's I should mention that we get a lot of help in our transcription translation from our student workers that we get at the institute every semester. But even when it is done by a student worker, or sometimes very minimal things that are we run through some transcription software to get at least basic uh, format in cases when uh, the interviews are in English. Then it goes through a rigorous uh, process of review, either by me or by my colleagues, Manuk or Dr. Lily Keshishan, people who worked with oral histories. So we then end up doing the final review and the tagging and uploading of these processes. All happens by us. So there is we do the assurance in that process to make sure everything is accurate.
Seda asks, have you or would you consider interviewing subsequent generations of, say, DPs, considering they have amazingly continued to keep strong ties with each other?
Yes, we did, I think, test interviews, two, three of them with the children of a couple of the people that we had interviewed. Um, so the interest was there both from the community and from us, but then COVID kind of had thrown this wrench in the middle of it, where this process stopped for a couple of years, and then we're now trying to revive it. But my personal goal too has been that as we get along to um, pretty much finalize this project and give access to them, then to move on to this subsequent generations who, as I meant, because especially since we started the California project, where the children and siblings or the younger generation who are no longer displaced persons themselves, but are part of the Los Angeles community in many ways, had been very integral part and members of this community by being here since the 40s, 50s. And that could kind of be the bridge connecting the displaced persons to the California history, as in their descendants with their stories, who both carry these DP narratives, but then and also have brought them into their practice and then their livelihood. And Ani knows it better than me, I think.
And Nora asks about your use of graduate students to work with metadata and do the translations.
Yeah, so we've had very few, I think maybe one or two graduate students that were used for this. Most of our students are undergrads, and we kind of, in many ways, prefer because undergrads are at USC longer, so they're like here at least 3, 4 years, especially when they start working. So when you train them, by the time they're like second, third year, they have acquired a lot of yeah experience with working with these stories, and it becomes some of them have really done a lot of work for these collections where they had become expert transcribers by the time they graduated. With graduate students, it's always a bit difficult because their course load is packed. They have already a lot of commitments. So it's very few of them who, first of all, reach out to do student work or have employment at the institute. But we are always welcoming whenever there is a connection or whenever there is somebody who is in our field who is either in the USC has a master's program in library science, or if somebody comes along that is interested themselves, or we see them and we approach them, or we had a case where we had an archivist who had an appointment at library, and then we asked them to uh, if they wanted to share some of their time with us, and they helped a lot with trying to conceptualize and understand how do we go about archiving these oral histories. So yeah, that it happens, but not to the scale where a lot of work ends up depending on graduate students.
Mark asks if Nasser is assisting with any of this work.
Not necessarily assisting with work. These are entirely projects of the Institute of Armenian Studies. They haven't been collaborative processes. But as far as Nasser goes, and Massachusetts in general, we did collaborate with the Armenians of Whitensville. Whitensville is a town in Massachusetts. It was an industrial center, which ended up being, that had a huge mill where it was one of the initial major gathering spots of Armenians in Massachusetts. So a few years ago, they reached out through Nasser and contacts to us that they wanted to document their stories because they had heard that we do oral histories. And we urged them to do it themselves in there, to keep this in Massachusetts, where with our help, we looked at some of their work, and then they were able to secure a grant from the state of Massachusetts and started this wonderful project where the community did these oral histories and then collected these materials. They have an Instagram page, they have a website, they collected these cookbooks and recipes from their elders. Wonderful process. So, which was a model that we thought could be replicated in other places because we are just one institution. We have a staff of about 5, 6 people. We cannot, in any imaginable way, take the responsibility of collecting the stories of Armenian Americans in this country, right? So it would be great that if we could create these collaborations where we provide the tools and whatever is needed, whatever that we have, that we could to these other institutions or other communities to start these projects themselves. So eventually, if after the project is completed, they do want it housed somewhere or they want to give the collection to us to include in the USC's collection, that would be welcome. But it should be done community-wise inside the community because this is important knowledge. These older generations pass, and this knowledge passes with them. That was kind of one of the catalysts to bring back to the DPs. Is in 2017, Mughnetsyan passed away, who was one of the leading members in this community, and then that kind of was kind of like a wake-up call for the community that our elders are dying, and then the story is going with them. That we need to document these things, that we need to keep for us, for our children, for the institutions in the community. That's an issue. A lot of major institutions themselves have not done a very good job of documentation of their own histories. And we are hoping that our work in many ways uh, inspires or brings people's attention to do this work in their own local communities and institutions.
Thank you. Note that I'm glad you brought that up, and also about the institutional sort of responsibility. We're at LAPL too. We're hosting, or we get requests to host a lot of collections because we have that sustainability built in, just like USC as an institution, and that's really important. Andrew asks, do you find the questions asked during your oral histories follow a structure, or do you go off script?
So for the displaced persons initially, which was our first collection, we had a areas of focus. That was our what we were going on. We had specific areas that were of interest to us that we wanted to delve in, and the we just a few questions to guide the conversation. So I would ask those questions. We had some questions that were being asked to everyone. For example, where were you born? When were you born? Who were your parents? Things like that. And then these would then dictate the follow-ups that we would provide. Because as I mentioned, in many cases, these were stories that people had just simply kept and not shared in many cases for 50, 60, 70 years. So we would ask the questions, and then it would bring up memories, it would bring up stories, and people would go on these tangents. My style of interviewing is that I don't interrupt a lot when people go on these tangents, because then people sometimes tend to lose their train of thought. So it would go, and then I would try to guide them to bring back to the conversation. So then I would need to have follow-ups and keep to not lose the uh, process or the timeline. Uh, so that's what was happening in many cases. But when it came down to understanding independence and to California history to Armenian experiences, we had prepared questionnaires already. We had prepared questionnaires, especially for understanding independence, because these were very particular things that we wanted to learn about the 1988 movement from the people who were centrally on these positions. So we would do those interviews and ask them specific questions. For example, one question that we asked everybody was when did you become aware that Soviet Union was collapsing? Which was bringing up some very interesting responses that you would think that people who were in this movement kind of felt that this was happening. But a lot of people, it was a general consensus was that even up until 1991, we didn't think this was going to collapse momentarily. We thought it was going to collapse, but we thought this was going to be more of a prolonged uh, experience. And then we have like almost 100 responses to this particular question that somebody can take and digest and then work with. So that's what we were doing. And then in many cases, especially for California interviews, my colleagues were doing pre-interviews. So because this was a larger collection, and then based on that, then we would tailor the questionnaire during the day of the interview. For example, if we knew that somebody was involved in the AGBU, then we would ask questions, include questions or a subsection for that. If we knew somebody had done several trips to the Republic of Armenia in the 1990s and been involved in the projects with that, then we would add a subsection to that. So whenever you would get to that point in the narration, then you would go to the subsection. And if the person wanted to talk more about that, then you would ask follow-ups on that. If not, then you would move back to the life story.
Lori's asking if these materials have been integrated in any way in classroom assignments and how can people use oral histories?
Yeah, as I mentioned, several people have assigned them to class. Our director, Dr. Shushank Karapetyan, has a class at USC every semester, and for many of those semesters, students were asked to do their final project on as an oral history, and or have an option to as one of their assignments to go out and interview somebody and create an example or a project on that. Um, Professor Mirna Durjan at Berkeley has used our questionnaires and assigned them to her students in Berkeley for a few times. So they have been asked a few years ago when California was drafting its ethnic studies curriculum. We were also consulted about that and suggested that this also be included in that curriculum. That if high school teachers or anybody wanted to, they could include this in their programs or reach out to us that or we could do the same. So we constantly get visitors from local area schools who bring their students to USC and come to the institute, and we share our oral histories, the work we do with them. So, and if there are if that brings then uh, collaborations afterwards, that those also happen. I have personally given guest lectures at several of the area schools and colleges based on our oral histories, where the professors have reached out that they wanted to, and we go with examples, with what we have in a collection, what are possibilities of use, and how can students integrate this in their work. And for foremost, our USC students. There are over 1,000 Armenian students at USC any given year. So when they reach out for their projects, and not just projects for Armenian classes, projects in history, in geography, in everything, wherever they need any primary source that might be an oral history, we gladly guide them or provide them access to them.
Okay, I think we're at the 10 o'clock hour, but we have one last question from Andrew. Have you dealt with circumstances in your oral histories that may go against the record of what is objectively known? Someone disputing events or order of events. How do you navigate that kind of landscape in an oral history?
Uh, yeah, so oral history, particularly about oral histories, is that um, they are not in they're not rigid history, right? These are, first of all, memories of people. These are personal views and opinions of people in sometimes, but then they're also their life stories, what they deem important for themselves to remember. Sometimes we get these questions like, oh, you didn't ask about this, or why didn't this person tell about that? But then at the end of the day, this is their story. And what might be interesting to me, especially for this, like displaced persons interviews, right? I would go in and then I would sometimes expect this like sensational things, or, but then at the end of the day, this was people's lives, or some things that are sensational to me, they would just tell in a very calm and nonchalant manner. But then I would be like, oh my God, that happened to you. But they were just like, well, yeah, that was our lives. And then sometimes they would just omit entire sections of stories, which to me seemed like an omission. But then to them, it was just non-important. So in many ways, we don't uh, direct people to tell stories, then that it wouldn't be an oral history. So they decide what is important to them to tell. We try to get as much out of it as we can with our questions, right? That's the job of the interviewer in that sense, that you ask the right questions and then get you the answers. but we don't then be like, oh, how about this thing you didn't tell about? Yeah. So, but yeah, that happens sometimes, and then you deal with them as you go. Some people afterwards want to look at their interviews and say, well, here, please do not include this, or I misremembered this. Or in many cases, I would get calls afterwards, and then be like, oh, I forgot to tell this. Can we just do a part two? Or here, I forgot to mention this person's name. And so in those situations, you just obviously you're like, no, 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 you don't get to say in this. But as I mentioned, oral history is a collaboration between the person interviewing and the person getting interviewed. So at the end of the day, you do what is best, both for you as a researcher, but above all for the person who has given you their life story.
Thank you so much, Gegham, for a wonderful presentation. You can tell we still have questions, so we might have a part two, talk more about oral histories. But thank you, everyone, also for joining us. Thank you so
Thank you
much.
very much. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Gegham.
Thank you very much. And then for everybody else, if you have any questions about our collections in particular, the work we do at the Institute, or if you have a wonderful lead for somebody we should interview, please don't hesitate to email, reach out. Armenian@usc.edu is our general email, and or just reach out to me personally, and we will be glad to connect.